In this chapter, we're going to add bone structures to create IK animations. IK stands for inverse kinematics. To understand inverse kinematics, the best thing to do is just show you this animation. So I'm going to test the movie in the Flash player, and you can take a look at the animation. So each one of these arms in this machine is an individual bone system. You notice that the part of the arm attached to the machine doesn't move very much, but as the parts of the arms that are smashing the olives move, the other arms move as well. So we're going to look at how to set up these bone systems to create these types of animations. So using inverse kinematics, you can create animations like these armatures here. In this chapter, you'll learn the ins and outs of creating IK animations in Flash. To create IK animations, the first thing you need to do is set up a bone system. You can set up the bone system using the bone tool in the toolbar. Before you add the bones, you need to make sure you're working with movie clip instances, not graphic symbols. So on the stage here, I have several different movie clip instances. Remember, you can create a movie clip by selecting any artwork and choosing Modify, Convert to Symbol, and then choose Movie Clip for the type. So I'll go to the Bone tool, and we'll begin creating the bone system. When you're creating the bone system, all you have to do is click and drag from one bone to the next. The important thing that you do is click from and drag to only the points that you want to hinge. So I'm going to zoom in. That way it's nice and easy to see what I'm doing. And with the bone tool, I'm going to click and drag from the part of the arm that's attached to the machine first. So you always want to start with the part that's going to be anchored. So if you're adding bones to a human on an arm, you would start at the shoulder, not the hand. So I'm going to start at the part that's anchored, and I'll click and drag to the next hinging part. That's the next little piece in here, the small one. And then I want this piece to hinge toward the beginning of the next shape. So I'll release my mouse button here. Notice that every time I release my mouse button, the object that I release it on comes to the front. So just keep that in mind when you're working with bones. So there's my bone system. When you create a bone system, you'll see that Flash creates a new layer for you. Mine is called Armature 6. Yours will most likely be called Armature 1. The bones in the bone system have the same color as your outline color for that layer. Once you have a bone system created, you could then move around the bone system using the selection tool. So go to the selection tool and then click and drag the hand for this machine. Obviously, it's not really a hand, but let's just call it the hand for simplicity. So I'm going to click and drag the hand, and notice the other bones move. And there's our armature. So to set up a bone system, you can need to work with movie clips, and you can set it up by using the bone tool and clicking and dragging to and from the hinge points. Once you've created a bone system, you can adjust some of the properties for your bone system through the Properties panel. There are two ways to do this. The first way is by selecting individual bones. Using the selection tool, I'll click on my bone system and then click on the first bone in my armature. In the Properties panel, you'll see settings for IK Bone. There are arrow buttons to enable me to navigate through my bone system. And then I have information like the name of each bone and the location of the bones, and then joint rotation and translation. Joint translation enables you to move the individual joints by themselves. So instead of just being connected at the bone system, they can sort of move independently. And for this example, we don't want to do that. What we want to do, though, is to set a constraint on the joint rotation. So I'll click Constrain for joint rotation, and the default constraint is plus or minus 45 degrees. And the default for this actually works pretty well, so I'm going to leave it as it is. Notice if I click and drag my bone system now, that if I go past the constraint, it works all right sometimes, but other times you see glitches like this. Just know that recording this title, I'm working in beta software, so there are some bugs. Hopefully on your release version of Flash CS5, you won't see the same problems. But even with these problems, know that the bone system works fine in the Flash player. This is just a bug for working in Flash and creating the bone systems. Early in this movie, I mentioned there were two ways to adjust bone properties. The other way is by selecting the frame span for your bone system in the timeline. So if I click on my frame span, you'll see that I have settings for an IK armature, different from an IK bone. Armature represents the bone system. So here I can adjust easing and the easing type, and then there's options for author time and runtime bone systems. We'll talk about that more in another movie. And then there's the style. This is the preview style for when you're working with a bone system. So if you look at the bones on the stage, if I change the style, I can preview them as wireframe or as lines. My personal preference is the default solid setting, so I'll leave it at that. So just remember that when you're working with a bone system, you can adjust bone properties through the Properties panel by selecting a bone or by selecting your frames in the timeline. Now we'll animate our bone system. You can animate a bone system fairly easily in Flash. Once you've created the bone system, the next step is to extend the timeline. So in my movie, I'm going to extend the timeline to frame 60. To do that, I'll click and drag from frame 60 in the top layer to frame 60 in the bottom layer. Once I've done that, I'll press the F5 key to extend the timeline to that point. Notice the olive color background for the armature. That represents an armature layer in the timeline and an armature animation. So think of it kind of like a motion tween. What I'm going to do is to make the animation loop, I'll copy the first keyframe to the last frame. So to do that, I'm going to right-click at the last frame, and then I'm going to choose Insert Pose. That's the equivalent of Insert Keyframe on a motion tween. So I'll choose Insert Pose, and then I'll go to frame 10. On frame 10, I'm going to make the arm move upward. So you can really do this however you'd like. I just have mine moving up like that, and if I scrub the playhead, you can see that animation. On frame 30, I'll move the arm back down, and then I'm going to rotate some of the bones. So click and drag this one, and then face the hand downward, and then click and drag the playhead to see how that works. So I want the arm to come up pretty quick, and then to move down a little bit more slowly, and then to push the olives. And to give the appearance of it pushing the olives really hard, I have that last part of the animation the slowest. So let's preview this animation in the Flash player. The arm moves up, then pushes the olives down. So to create an IK animation, all you have to do is extend the timeline and then set the poses however you'd like. So let's say we wanted to copy this animation and have multiple arms. You're already familiar with graphic symbols, so your first thought may be to just nest these in graphic symbols. And actually, that's an excellent way to accomplish this task. To do that, you might expect to right-click your animation in the timeline and choose some setting. But notice there isn't a setting to copy frames or anything. So what you need to do is actually right-click your bones on the stage. So when I right-click the bones, there's an option to convert to symbol. I'm going to choose that option. I'm going to choose a graphic symbol for the type, and I'll call this Arm Animation. Then I'll click OK. Now if I scrub the playhead, I can see the animation as one frame as a graphic symbol on the main timeline. Now all I have to do is copy and paste this instance, and I have multiple arms. So I'm going to copy it, and I'll create a new layer and paste. I'll call this new layer Arm 2. I'll create one more layer called Arm 3, then I'll paste there as well. Note that I'm using paste in place and not the regular paste command. So let's lock Arm 3, and that'll be the top layer. And then I'm going to lock Arm and make sure all the other layers are locked as well. And I'm going to pull out Arm 2 a little bit. So I'll move Arm 2 out. And then if I want to, I can scale it in a little bit. So I can select it, and with the free transform tool, I can move the transformation point, scale it in just a little bit, and then move it a little bit more. Now I'll go to the back arm, which is the layer that's just called Arm, and I'll move that one over, and I'll do the same process where I shrink it. So I'll move the transformation point, scale it in. I'm holding the Shift key, by the way. That way I can constrain the proportions of my object. And then I'll move everything down. I'm going to move the Arm 2 layer down just a little bit more, and that looks good. So let's preview this animation in the Flash player. Remember, that's Control Enter on the PC and Command Return on the Mac. Okay, so I have my animation of 3 arms, but this would look a lot better if I staggered the animation of the arms. And remember that with graphic symbols, you can do that. So all I have to do is select one of the arms, arm 3 for example, and then go in the Properties panel and set the looping property. So I'll change the first frame to frame 20 for this one, and then I'll select the middle arm and change the first frame to frame 40. Now let's preview this animation in the Flash player. So now we have a staggered animation of the arms moving. So if you ever want to convert an armature to a symbol, make sure you right-click the bones on the stage and choose Convert to Symbol. And once you have multiple animations, you can always stagger them in the Properties panel using the looping settings. One of the features of bones in Flash is the ability to have bones go at runtime. Runtime bones make bones interactive in the Flash player. This interactivity works just like it does when you're working in Flash, except for it happens while your movie is playing. All you have to do to set Runtime Bones is click on the frame where your armature is in the timeline, and then in the Properties panel, set the bone type to Runtime. With Runtime Bones, you can test the movie and click and drag the bone system just like you would with the selection tool on the timeline. Now you may want to use this when you're creating a game or some other type of application. The output window when I tested the movie says that runtime symbols with skewed matrices should be wrapped in a movie clip. So if I wanted to, I can wrap this animation in a movie clip symbol, but I'm not applying a skew to this animation right now, so I'm not worried about it. So just know that when you want to apply a runtime bone system, all you do is select the frames in the timeline and apply it through the Properties panel. Flash CS5 has introduced a new feature to working with bone systems. This feature is called Spring. Spring allows Flash to automatically add realistic physics to your bone systems. Let's take a look at the animation I have on the stage here. I have a pendulum in a clock swinging from the right to the center. That's all this animation does. But you're going to see that when I apply Spring, Flash is going to apply physics to this animation to make the pendulum swing from left to right. To apply Spring, you need to do two things. First, you need to turn on Spring for your animation. To do that, click on your frames in the timeline and make sure springs are enabled in the Properties panel. Once you've enabled springs, you can then click on individual bones to apply the spring. So I'm going to click on the main long bone here for my pendulum, and I'll apply the spring at the bottom of the Properties panel. There are two settings for spring: strength and damping. Strength refers to the power of the spring effect. So let's just click and drag that all the way to 100. We'll talk about damping in just a second. I'm going to click in the pasteboard to make sure the spring effect is applied. Notice my animation updated as soon as I clicked. Let's see what this looks like in the Flash player. So you can see the pendulum moving back and forth. Now notice that this is a little bit faster than a regular clock would move back and forth. So if you wanted to, you can obviously extend or shorten this animation, just like any other animation in Flash. Now let's look at the damping feature. The damping feature decays the strength value over time. To see the most obvious effect, I'm just going to click and drag it up to 100. Before I test the movie, I'm going to click in the pasteboard to make sure the damping is applied. I'll test the movie to preview the application in the Flash player. So notice the pendulum swings back and forth and eventually slows down to stop in the middle. So again, Spring applies realistic physics to your IK animations. While bones can be a useful tool in Flash, bone systems only work in Flash Player 10 or above. So if you had to publish your application to a lower version of the Flash player, you wouldn't be able to use an armature animation. To get around that, you can convert an armature animation to a frame-by-frame animation. On the stage, I have a graphic symbol that contains an armature animation. To convert it, I'll double-click the symbol to enter the symbol's timeline. Now I'm inside the arm animation timeline. So in the timeline, you can see my armature animation. To convert this to a frame-by-frame animation, I'll click to select the entire frame span, then I'll right-click all the frames and choose Convert to Frame-by-Frame Animation. Flash then converts the armature animation to a frame-by-frame animation. Now I can use the same armature feature in an earlier version of the Flash player. Just keep in mind that when you use this feature, you can't go back to an armature, so make sure your armature animation is finalized before converting to a frame-by-frame animation. Motion tweens require Flash Player 10 or above. If you're going to publish to an earlier version of the Flash player, you'll need to understand how Classic Tweens work so that you can create tweens using symbols. You can recognize a Classic Tween by its purple background in the timeline. Like a shape tween, a successful Classic Tween has an arrow, and an unsuccessful Classic Tween has a dashed line. To create a Classic Tween, you'll need an instance of a symbol at one frame, and then at another frame, you'll need another instance of that same symbol. Then you can create the tween, which again will be successful if you see an arrow, and unsuccessful if you see a dashed line. Just like shape tweens, the only times your Classic Tweens will be unsuccessful is if you don't follow the rules. And the only rules are that you have one instance of one symbol on the start and end keyframes. Throughout this chapter, you'll get some practice creating Classic Tweens, and you'll learn all about how to use them in your applications. Let's look at how to create a Classic Tween. So we have a start keyframe with an instance of a symbol on it. Now we'll just define the end keyframe. So I'll select frame 60 in the timeline and press F6 on the keyboard to insert a keyframe. Note that when you press that command, Flash creates a copy of the last keyframe. So I have a keyframe at frame 60 and frame 1. I'll go back to frame 1 and move the girl on the bike to the left outside of the frame. I'll hold Shift on my keyboard to constrain her position. Now I'll create the Classic Tween by right-clicking in between my two keyframes and choosing Create Classic Tween. Flash then creates a Classic Tween, which I can tell is a success because of the purple background and the arrow. Let's preview this animation in the Flash player. And there it is. So to create a Classic Tween, you need an instance at one frame and then another instance at a later keyframe, and then you right-click in between them and choose Create Classic Tween. Occasionally, when you're working with a Classic Tween, you may see the dreaded dashed line in the timeline. When you see that, your tween is broken. So I can scrub the playhead, and it looks like my animation is working. The sun looks like there is some sort of problem. See how it flashes on and off, and it sort of moves sporadically. So go to the first frame, and we'll take a look at this and see if we can fix the problem. To select all the artwork on a keyframe, you can just simply click on that keyframe in the timeline. So click on frame 1 of the biker layer to see if there's any extra artwork. And sure enough, the sun is on that layer as well. So let's see what happens when I move the sun off of that layer. I'll select the sun, cut it, create a new layer, drag the layer to the bottom, rename the layer to sun, use the Paste in Place command to paste the sun in. Notice that when I did that, the Classic Tween fixed itself. So now not only does the animation work, but the sun also stays in the same place. So remember that when you're trying to fix a Classic Tween, just click on the keyframes to see if there's any other artwork there that's creating the problem. If that doesn't fix it, make sure you confirm that there's only one instance of a symbol on starting and ending keyframes, and that each instance is an instance of the same symbol. When you take those steps, your Classic Tweens will work every time. When you're working with a Classic Tween, you don't have the option to use the motion editor, so you'll have to use the Properties panel to add effects like easing. Classic Tweens don't have as powerful easing control as motion tweens do, but there are some things that you can do. Let's take a look at how it works. Select one of the frames of your Classic Tween in the timeline, and then go to the Tweening section of the Properties panel to adjust easing. You'll also notice some other sections like Rotate, where you can rotate an object, and a few checkboxes down here like Orient to Path, where you can make an object follow along a path. For easing, I'm just going to click and drag the slider all the way up to ease out. Remember, easing out makes an animation go faster at the beginning and slower at the end. Let's take a look at this animation in the Flash player. So the biker comes in and slows down as she gets closer to the end. So to add simple easing to a Classic Tween, select the tween in the timeline, and then set the easing in the Tweening section of the Properties panel. The Properties panel gives you options for adjusting easing curves for Classic Tween. To access those options, click on your Classic Tween in the timeline and then click the Edit Easing Curves button in the Properties panel. The icon looks like a pencil. When you click that button, the custom Ease In, Ease Out window opens up. In this window, you can control easing for individual properties, or you can use one setting for all properties. If you want to ease individual properties, uncheck the Use One Setting for All Properties checkbox, and then choose the property you want to edit easing for. For right now, I just want to use one setting for all properties, so I'll make sure that box is checked. In this window, you can see the tween represented on the left, from 0% to 100%, and the frames represented on the bottom. So editing this curve is pretty much exactly like editing an easing curve in the motion editor. So what I want to do here is make the ease out effect a little more strong. To do that, I'll click at the bottom left anchor point, and then I'll drag the Bezier curve like so. Now see, this arc is a little bit more steep at the beginning, and then it goes up very slowly towards the end. So this is a very strong ease out effect. Note that if you want to, you can click inside of here to add additional anchor points. For right now, I don't need to do that, so I'm going to delete the anchor point by Option or Alt clicking it. I'll set the easing back to how I wanted it, and then I'll click OK. I'll test the movie in the Flash player and see the strong easing for my animation. So when you want more tight control over your easing curves, select your tween and then click the pencil icon in the Properties panel to open up the custom easing window. Classic tweens actually work pretty well for character animation. In this movie, we'll look at how to animate the girl's leg using a classic tween. I'll enter Symbol Editing mode by double-clicking the biker on the stage. Everything is set up for the animation except for her front leg. All we have to do is set up the last frame and then create a classic tween. So I'll go to the last frame and then create keyframes for the top 4 layers. I'll do this by deselecting all the frames and then clicking and dragging from the last frame of the top layer to the last frame of the 4th layer down. And I'll press F6 on my keyboard to create keyframes. Now here, our goal is to get the girl's foot on the pedal. So let's zoom in, and we'll do that using the Free Transform tool. So I'll use the Free Transform tool and then move the anchor point to the top right of the leg. Now I'll rotate the leg, then I'll select her foot and the bottom of her leg, move the transformation point, and rotate so her foot's on the pedal. And that looks good. So I can use that hinging effect for my classic tween. Now to apply the classic tween, I'm going to click and drag from frame 1 on the seat layer to frame 16 on the front leg top layer. Now I have that whole set of frames selected. I can right click and choose Create Classic Tween to add the classic tween to the animation. So now let's preview the animation in the Flash player and see how much more fluid the animation looks using a tween compared to using a frame-by-frame animation. So when you're working with character animation, you can create the keyframes for a classic tween and then modify the individual elements by selecting them all and setting the transformation point for all of your selected elements using the Free Transform tool. This chapter hasn't covered everything there is to know about classic tweens because motion tweens are the preferred tweening method for Flash CS5. For detailed information about animating using classic tweens, see Flash CS3 Professional Fundamentals in the lynda.com online training library. A button symbol's timeline is different from the timeline of a graphic symbol. If I double-click the button instance on the stage, you can see that. Button symbols have 4 frames on the timeline, and those frames have labels instead of numbers. There's the up frame, the over frame, the down frame, and the hit frame. The up frame represents what the button looks like with no mouse interactivity. The over frame represents what the button looks like when the mouse hovers over the button. The down frame appears when the mouse is down on top of the button, and the hit frame never appears. The hit frame is the hot spot for the button. So when you roll over anything inside of the hit frame, that's what enables the over and down states for the button. Throughout this chapter, you'll learn the details about working with buttons in Flash. To create a button symbol in Flash, you can pretty much start out with any artwork you'd like. On the stage here, I have a graphic symbol, but of course you could start out with just text, a bitmap image, or just a simple vector shape. I'll select my object on the stage and then go to Modify, Convert to Symbol. For the name, I'll type button1, and for the type, I'll choose button. Then I'll click OK. Now when I have the instance selected, you can see that I have an instance of button1. And if I double-click the button, I'll enter its timeline. So we have the up, over, down, and hit frames. For simplicity's sake, I've already built the states for this button, but you could add any artwork you like. I'll create keyframes at the over, down, and hit frames. For the over and down keyframes, I'll press F6. But for the hit keyframe, I'm going to press F7. We'll draw the hit state later on in this movie. So let's go to the over frame, and I'm going to swap this instance out with another one. So I'll select the instance on the stage and click the swap button in the properties panel. I'll swap it out with BTN1 over. Then I'll go to the down button and repeat the process. I'll select the instance on the stage, click the swap button, choose BTN1 down, and make the change. Now for the hit state, I'm going to use the rectangle tool, and I'm going to remove the stroke. I'm doing that because with a hit state, a stroke is not counted anyway. So I'll use a bright color that I'm not using anywhere else in my application, and then I'm going to draw a rectangle. But what's important to me is that I draw a rectangle around the actual space of the button. And right now I can't see the button on the stage. To get a preview of what the button looks like so I can get the size right when I'm drawing the hit state, I'm going to turn on onion skin. So I'll click the onion skin button at the bottom of the timeline. I'll drag the markers so that I only see the down state. If that yellow color for you is hard to see, you can expand the markers to cover all the states of the button. Then click and drag on the stage to draw a rectangle that covers all the artwork for the button. Now I'll turn off onion skin and test the movie in the Flash player. So here's my button, and when I roll over anywhere that's included in the hit state, the button will be activated. So I'll see my over state when I hold my mouse down, I'll see the down state, and when I release the mouse button, I'll see the over state again, and when I roll out, I'll see the up state. So to recap, you can create a button just like any other symbol, just choose button in the symbol type. Then you can define the different states of the button in symbol editing mode. You can add layers to button symbols to add content like text. Of course, you don't have to use layers, but let me show you the advantage to using them in this movie. On the stage, I'm going to double-click the instance of button 2. And then when I'm inside of the button symbol, I'm going to create a new layer by clicking the New Layer button at the bottom left of the timeline. I'll rename the new layer to Text. I'll lock layer 1, and then using the text tool, I'll type out some text. Before typing the text, I'm going to change the color to white. I'm going to make sure the font family is Chaparral Pro, and the style is bold. And then I'm going to make sure I'm using the text layout framework. So I'll change the engine from Classic Text to TLF Text, and then I'll click on the stage once to create a text field. Using caps lock, I'll type Explore. I'll press Escape and turn off caps lock so I can exit text editing mode. It looks like this font is a little bit too big, so I'll move it in, and then in the Properties panel, I'll shrink the size a little bit. 18 point looks just about right. I'll use my keyboard to get it in place. So there's my other layer, which is the text layer. Now, by using one layer, I'm not wasting space by putting the same text on each frame inside of the button. That way, if I have to make a change in my text, I only have to change it once, because it's only on one frame. Just remember that you can add layers to button symbols just like you can in any other symbol as well as on the main timeline. In this movie, we'll look at how to create invisible buttons in Flash. You can tell that you're looking at an invisible button because you'll see a semi-transparent teal rectangle. Let's preview this application in the Flash player so that you can see how an invisible button works. So if I roll over the trees, you see that one button pops up. If I roll over the trees over here, the 2 button pops up. So I can roll over different parts of the application and the buttons pop up. So let's take a look at how to create your own invisible button. The 5 button right here is already a button symbol. So let's look at how to convert this to an invisible button. The first thing I'm going to do is zoom in. Then I'll use the selection tool and double-click the button to enter its timeline. The first thing I'll do is click and drag the keyframe on the up frame over to the over frame. So now I have a blank keyframe on the up frame. That's created the invisible button. Now I'll go to the hit frame and press F7 on the keyboard to insert a blank keyframe. Once there, I'll use the rectangle tool with a bright color fill and no stroke to draw the hit state. I'm going to draw this around the hit area that I want, and that's around these buildings here. So I'm just going to click and drag a rectangle around the buildings. And that will create my hit area. Now I'll return to the main timeline by clicking Scene 1 at the top left of the screen. You can then see the semi-transparent teal rectangle. Let's test the movie to preview this application in the Flash player. So now when I hover over the buildings on the left, the 5 button will appear. So there you have an invisible button. To create an invisible button, simply move artwork away from the up frame. You can tell that you're looking at an invisible button when you see a semi-transparent teal rectangle on the stage. In this chapter, we're going to be working with movie clip symbols. Movie clip symbols work different from graphic symbols and, of course, buttons. You can create a movie clip symbol by selecting any piece of artwork and then pressing the keyboard shortcut F8. You can choose movie clip symbol for the type, and that's all you need to do to create a movie clip symbol. By this point, you should have a lot of practice creating symbols, so I'm not going to go into that process in detail. Let's take a look at our movie clip on the stage. When I select the biker, you'll see that it's a movie clip in the Properties panel. It's an instance of a movie clip named Biker. Notice my timeline only has one frame. If I double-click the Biker movie clip, you'll see that it has multiple frames. If this were a graphic symbol, the main timeline would need enough frames to accommodate this animation. But with a movie clip symbol, the animation will loop regardless of whether there is enough frames on the main timeline. So you can think of a movie clip as almost a self-contained, independent Flash movie. So a movie clip plays on its own, independent of any other objects. So let's go back to Scene 1, or the main timeline, and test this application in the Flash player. So you can see the biker animate even though there's only one frame on the main timeline. Another difference between a movie clip and a graphic symbol is that with a movie clip, you can communicate to the object using ActionScript code. That means you can command the movie clip to change while your Flash movie is playing. So you can move it, rotate it, scale it, and a number of other things in the Flash player. So what I want you to take out of this movie is that a movie clip is essentially a self-contained Flash movie and plays independently of the main timeline. So you can have a movie clip symbol that has multiple frames of animation and only one frame of animation on the main timeline, and the movie clip will still animate. Let's say you had an animation stored in a graphic symbol and you wanted to convert that animation into a movie clip. There are 2 steps to doing that. Instances have something called a behavior, and they're linked to a symbol. So if you want to change a graphic symbol that's already on the stage, you'll need to change both the behavior and the symbol itself. Let's look at changing the symbol first. I'll go to the library, and then I'm going to find the biker animation. It's a graphic symbol. You could tell because of the graphic symbol icon. Note that the movie clip icon has a purple background and does not have the same shapes as the graphic symbol. So I'll right-click the biker graphic symbol and choose Properties. In this menu, I can change the type of the symbol by clicking the drop-down. So I'll go to Movie Clip and then click OK. So the biker is now a movie clip symbol. I mentioned earlier that you had to change the behavior as well. If you select the biker on the stage and go to the Properties panel, you'll see that the drop-down menu for instance behavior at the top of the Properties panel says graphic symbol. This is something that may be a little bit confusing in Flash. You can actually tell symbols to behave as different symbol types. So if I have a graphic on the stage, I can use this drop-down menu and tell Flash to treat that instance as a movie clip and make its timeline play independently. So what I'm going to do here is change the behavior of this instance to movie clip. Now I've successfully changed this graphic symbol to a movie clip. And if I test the movie in the Flash player, you can see that it animates independent of the main timeline. Using movie clips, you can create seamless animations. In this movie, we'll look at how to do that. To start out, I'm going to show you the animation that I've created in the Flash player. So I'll test the movie. And just notice the background elements animating. They animate in a seamless loop. I accomplished this by animating two graphic symbols and having one act as a buffer. To see how that works, I'll select the hills in the front on the screen, then I'll convert that to a movie clip symbol, and then I'll drop the graphic symbol inside of a movie clip by going to Modify, Convert to Symbol. For the type, I'll choose Movie Clip, and I'll name this Front Hills Animation. Now I'll double-click the hills to enter the timeline. So now I'm inside of Front Hills Animation, and I have the graphic symbol of the hills on the stage. The first thing I'll do is make a copy of the hills. So I'll pan a little bit to the side, and then Option or Alt drag the hills to the left. That'll create the copy. And just as a note, I created the artwork like this on purpose so the artwork would be seamless when I put the buffer in place. So let's create some motion tweens. I'll select the original hills and choose Create Motion Tween with a right click. And then I'll go back to the first frame and right click Copy and choose Create Motion Tween. So I have two motion tweens. At the last frame of my timeline, I'm going to click and drag to select both sets of hills, and then I'm going to drag the hills to the right while holding the Shift key, and I want to drop them just before the right edge of the hills hits the right edge of the stage. So I'll refine this position with my keyboard. That way, when the animation loops and the original hills are aligned with the right edge of the stage, it will look natural. If I had it set up so the copied hills were at the right edge of the stage here, then it would look like the animation holds in the same spot for a while. And I don't want that. So I want that loop to be seamless, so I'm going to put it just before that right edge. So let's test the movie in the Flash player to see how this looks. So there's the animation. And keep in mind, if you wanted to change the speed of the animation, you can always click and drag at the end of the frame span to increase or decrease the duration of the animation. Using movie clips, you can create animated buttons. In this movie, we'll look at how to do that. On the stage, I have an instance of a button symbol. If I double-click the button symbol, I can enter its timeline. If I go to the Over state, you can see that I have an instance of a movie clip. What I'm going to do is wrap this movie clip inside of another movie clip and then animate the original one. I'll press F8 to convert this movie clip into a symbol, and this will wrap the movie clip inside of another movie clip, so make sure to choose movie clip for the type button animation for the name, and then click OK. So now I can see I have an instance of button animation selected. So I'll double click the instance on the stage, and now I'm inside of button animation. And when I select the artwork on the stage, I have an instance of a symbol in here, and now I can make a motion tween. So I'll right click, choose Create Motion Tween. I'll go to frame 110, and then press F5 on my keyboard to extend the timeline to that point. At frame 110, I'll right click, and then insert some keyframes. So I'll choose Insert Keyframe, All. Now I'll create a really simple animation. I'll go to frame 55, select the button, and using the Free Transform tool, I'll scale the button up a little bit. I'm holding the Shift key to constrain the proportions. So let's test the movie in the Flash player. So on the up state of the button, you see the static instance of Overstar 2, and then the animation appears when you roll over the button. When I roll out, the animation stops and goes back to the beginning. So to create an animated button, all you need to do is drop an animated movie clip into one of the states of your button. A blend mode allows you to define how the colors in an object will interact with the colors in an object behind it. So let's take a look at the three squares I have on the stage. Each of these squares has a different blend mode applied. If I double click the first square, you'll see that it's white. So I have a white square, and it's an instance of a movie clip called Overlay. The other squares are instances of the same symbol called Blend. Notice that they look different. If I double-click the blend symbol, you'll see that I have a medium gray color. This color is exactly halfway between white and black. To set a blend mode, you need to start with an instance of a movie clip. So you'll create a movie clip, and then select it on the stage, and then go to the Display section in the Properties panel. There are really only 3 blend modes that you need to be familiar with. Most of the rest of the blend modes are variations on these 3. When I click the drop-down menu, you'll see a lot of different blend modes to choose from. The main blend modes are Overlay, Screen, and Multiply. Normal is the default, and Layer X pretty much like normal. So normal is good most of the time, but for special cases, you'll use blend modes like Multiply, Screen, and Overlay. The Overlay blend mode removes any medium gray inside of your shape and increases contrast. So if you look at the square on the left, I had it white. So you can see that generally this part of the image is lighter and there's more contrast. So again, Overlay gets rid of medium gray and increases contrast. The next one is Multiply. Multiply makes things darker. So the medium gray square that I used for the blend symbol is making the background image darker here. And finally, Screen makes things lighter. So the same medium gray square with a blend mode of Screen makes the background image lighter. So using blend modes, you can control how the colors in a movie clip instance react to the colors in the object behind it. Using blend modes, I can make changes to objects that aren't otherwise possible in Flash. For example, on the stage here I have a bitmap image of a flower. Now let's say I wanted to make the flower appear lighter. To do that, I'll take the flower image, which is an instance of a movie clip. I'll create a new layer. I'll call the new layer flawer2. Then I'm going to copy the flower to the flawer2 layer. To do that, I'll select the flower keyframe on the flower layer, and then again I'll hold the Alt or Option key, click and drag once more, and when I click and drag you'll see my cursor update to show a plus icon, indicating that I'm going to copy the frame. I'll release my mouse button, and then release the Alt key. So I've successfully copied the flower onto the flawer2 layer. So for the flawer2 layer, I'll select the instance of the movie clip, and then I'll go to the blending drop-down in the Properties panel, and choose Screen. Note that the blend modes are grouped together in sections that perform similar functionality. So Darken is grouped with Multiply, Lighten is grouped with Screen, and Overlay is grouped with Hard Light. So I'll choose Screen to make the image lighter. And there you go. So one of the practical uses of blend modes is to make changes to bitmap images that you couldn't make unless you had another application, like Photoshop. So by applying the blend mode, I can make this change directly in Flash. Using filters, you can apply special effects to movie clip instances, button instances, and text fields. So on the stage here, I have 3 instances of the same symbol. You can see in the Properties panel that I've selected an instance of flower button. So let's take a look at this drop shadow for the first button. The drop shadow filter and all other filters are applied using the Filters section of the Properties panel. So first, you select the compatible object, again, button, movie clip, or text field, then go to the Filters section in the Properties panel, and then click the Add Filter button. That's the paper icon. That's the same artwork as the new layer icon. So when you click that, you can select a filter type and then apply it. Since I've already applied a filter, I'm not going to apply any more. However, just because I've applied one filter doesn't mean I can't apply more. If you want to apply more filters, you can always keep adding them on. This object has a drop shadow applied. Notice it has a whole bunch of settings like blur X, blur Y, strength, quality, angle, distance, etc. Once I've added a filter, I can control the appearance of the filter by modifying these settings. So I can change the angle of my drop shadow. I can change the distance from the original object, and anything else in this menu. If you've created settings for a filter that you'd like to reuse, you can save those as a preset by clicking the Presets button. When you click the Presets button, which is immediately to the right of the New Filter button, you can click Save As to save the filter. You can then add a preset name, like My Drop Shadow. and then reapply it to any other object by clicking the Presets button. The bevel filter is applied in the same way. Click the New Filter button, choose Bevel, and then adjust the settings here. One of the other filters is the Adjust Color filter. Notice that it's different from the Tint color effect. If I were to apply a green tint to this shape, the whole shape would be green. You can see that here. I'll apply the color effect of a green tint in the Properties panel. So the whole shape is green. But using the Adjust Color filter, I'm not modifying any of the white artwork. So I get a more natural look with the Adjust Color filter than I do with a tint. So to recap, filters are special effects you can apply to movie clip instances, button instances, and text fields, and you can add them in the Properties panel. Now we'll look at a practical application for using filters. On this stage, I have my biker. So she's riding a bike, and I'll preview the animation in the Flash player. So we have a seamless looping background with some other elements. What we're going to do is use a filter to create a shadow for the girl on the bike. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually copy the girl. So I'm not going to use the default drop shadow effect. I'm going to kind of customize it and create my own type of drop shadow. So I'll copy and create a new layer called Shadow. And I'll paste in place. Remember that Shift-Command-V. And of course I drag the shadow below the biker layer, but it doesn't matter whether the shadow is in front or behind the original layer. With the biker locked, I'll use the Free Transform tool, move the transformation point at the bottom center, and then click and drag down for the shadow. Then I'm going to skew using the Free Transform tool, move the girl to the right. Now I'm doing this because of the position of the sun. So the sun is here and the light is being cast in this direction. So the shadow would be cast in about this way. So we have the girl in place. Now I'm going to take this instance of the girl and swap it out with a shadow. To do that, I'll select the instance and then go to the Filters section of the Properties panel and click to add a drop shadow filter. I'm going to collapse the other sections in the Properties panel to get a little bit better view of the filters area. So here I can customize my filter to suit my needs. So for right now, I don't really want to see the girl there. I just want to see the shadow itself. So to do that, I can just click the Hide Object checkbox, and then the girl disappears and I still have the shadow. Also, I want the distance to be 0 pixels. So it will be at the same place as the original artwork. So if I want to, I can modify things like the color of the shadow, I can modify the opacity by adjusting the strength, and I can control the blur as well. I like a really soft blur for this type of shadow, so I'll leave it at 2 pixels. And feel free to make any other changes that you'd like. But the great thing about using an animated movie clip as a shadow is the fact that the animation is reflected in the shadow. So let's test this out in the Flash player and see what it looks like. So you can see the girl pedaling in the shadow and in the original animation. So by applying filters to your applications, you can create realistic effects like the shadow we created here. Flash accepts most common audio file formats. That includes WAV files, MP3 files, and AAC encoded files. There are other audio types you can import into Flash, but those are the most common. You can find out more information about audio files in Flash through Flash Help. That's under Help, Flash Help. Once you've added sound to your application, you can click on the sound in the timeline and adjust the syncing options in the Properties panel. For the syncing options, there are 4 different options you can choose from: Event, Start, Stop, and Stream. Event is for things that are triggered by events. So think of something like a button. So an event would be like a button press. So with an event, a sound will play every time the playhead hits the frame where the sound is, regardless of whether the sound is already playing or not. So if you have a button that makes a sound, maybe you want to be able to click it over and over and over again, and each time you click it, the sound doesn't stop and start again, but a new sound is created. So event is for events and is very bad for things like music, because if the playhead hits the frame where the music starts, then the sound will start playing over itself and you have all kinds of problems. Start is better for music because it starts the sound only if the playhead hits the frame where the sound resides and the sound is not already playing. Stop, of course, stops sounds, and stream is used to sync sound with an animation. Stream drops frames of animation to keep up with the sound. Also, with a streaming sound, you can scrub the playhead to preview the sound through the timeline. So again, it's very useful for syncing sounds with animations. So the main thing I want you to take out of this is that Flash accepts most common audio file types. You can select sounds in the timeline and modify sound properties through the Properties panel. You can import audio files into Flash just like importing any other file. Go to File, Import, and then you can choose Import to Stage or Import to Library. Now, Import to Stage is grayed out here because I have a locked layer selected, so don't worry about that. But if you choose either one, the sound just goes into the library and doesn't go on the stage, so it doesn't really matter. I'll choose Import to Library, and then I'm going to import music.mp3. Sound now appears in the library. To get the sound into my animation, all I need to do is create a layer for it. Now, you don't really need a layer just for sound, but I prefer doing this because it's confusing when you mix sound with other layers. This way, I put all my sounds on the same layer, and it's easy to find and control those sounds. So I'll change the name of this layer to Sounds. And then I'm going to click and drag music.mp3 from the library onto the stage. Now, you may have noticed that the frame where I dragged the sound updated to show a sound wave. It's pretty hard to see on my screen right now, but if I extend the timeline, you'll see that you can preview the sound waves. I'm going to undo adding the frames. And that's really all there is to it. Once you've imported a sound file into your application, you can edit the compression of the sound file through the library. Remember, controlling the compression of an audio file is just like controlling the compression of an image. You can reduce the file size without ever affecting the original file. And any changes that I make in Flash are not going to permanently damage the imported file in Flash, so I can always go back to the original. So just keep that in mind that you're not going to make any permanent changes to the sound by messing with the compression settings through the library. To open up the compression settings window, double-click the sounds icon in the library. Remember, don't double-click the name. That's going to open up the name changing mode. Double-click the sounds icon, and Flash will open up the sound properties window. In here, you'll see that compression is set to the default. To adjust the sound compression, click the drop-down and choose a compression mode. Here, you just need to know that ADPCM and RAW offer very little compression, which means larger file sizes. Speech gives a lot of compression and is really best for speech. And MP3 is usually the best choice for songs. So anything that's really short, like a sound for a button, would be okay if you used ADPCM or RAW, and for longer sounds, use MP3 or speech. So I'll select MP3, and then I can control the bit rate. The default is 16 kilobits per second, and then you can control the quality with the drop-down menu here. I'm just going to leave the default fast, and most of the time, you're going to want to just keep it at fast. So click the test button to preview the compressed sound. So I'll click Stop to stop the sound. Now you can adjust the compression settings however you'd like. So I can raise the compression and compare that to the lower compression. Note the feedback at the bottom of the menu. Flash tells you that the file size right now is 521.3 kilobytes, which is 11.3% of the original. If I go back to 16 kilobits per second, then the file size is 52K. So this impacts the size of your Swift file. Again, all of these are only applied when you export your file as a Swift. So your FLA contains the original music file, and these compression settings are only applied when you output your Swift file. So I'll click OK, and then I'll test the movie in the Flash player to hear the sound. So to adjust sound compression settings, just double-click the sound icon in the library. Let's take a look at the sound properties you can adjust in the Properties panel. So I'll select the layer that has my sounds on that frame where the sound is applied, and then we'll take a look in the Properties panel. Here, you'll see Sound Settings. In the Name dropdown, you can choose which sound file you want to play. Since I only have one file, I only have the option to choose None or Music.mp3. We already talked about the sync option, so you can set those there, and then you can choose whether you want the sound to repeat a certain number of times or to loop. There's also a drop-down to apply sound effects. So I'll click the drop-down menu, and then I can choose from one of the built-in effects. So I can have the sound be only on the left channel or the right channel, or fade from right to left or left to right, or I can have it fade in or fade out. I'll choose fade in. Let's test the application in the Flash player. Command return on the Mac, Control Enter on the PC. You can then hear the audio fading in as the movie plays. If you want more powerful control over your audio, you can click the pencil icon to open up the Edit Envelope option. So here, I can modify how the sound works by adding and removing keyframes and adjusting them so you can control the volume of the left and right channels of your sound individually. I'm just going to click Cancel. So when you want to add effects to your sound, you can select your sound in the timeline and apply the effects through the Properties panel. In this movie, we'll look at how to sync sound to an animation. So I'm going to test what I have here in the Flash player. So you can hear the machine making movements. The sound for those animations are embedded inside of the MC movie clip and the Gears movie clip. So I have the sounds inside of those movie clips, and if I double click them, you can see I have them inside of there, and I've set both of them to be start sounds. So I don't want that sound to be looping over itself, which would happen if I had it set to event. So I have it at start, and then let's take a look at the drop sound. So we're going to add the drop sound for the drop going into the barrel. So I'm going to double click the drop on the main timeline, and here I have the drop animation. So I've already created the sound layer. Now, using sound, all you have to do is put a keyframe in the right spot, drop in the audio file, and then you can move around that keyframe so that it works with your animation. So let's say I created a keyframe on frame 3. I can do that with F6 or F7. Both will create a blank keyframe because frame 1 has a blank keyframe. So I'll go to the library and click and drag to drop the audio file that starts with 13 onto the stage. So I drop that in there, and then you can see the sound in the timeline. So you notice the sound happens a little bit early. And the reason why I can hear it is because the sound is set to be a streaming sound. So you may want to make that change now, because that's the best way to sync a sound with an animation. So let's look at how to move the sound. So I want that sound to happen as the drop is falling into the bucket. All I have to do is select the keyframe and click and drag to move it. That looks good. So I'll test the movie in the Flash player and see what it looks like. There you have it. If you're having trouble seeing your sound waves in the timeline, you can expand the layer size in a few different ways. One way is to go to the options area of the timeline and then choose one of the larger frame sizes. You can go to Preview to see a large version of your frames, so I can more clearly see the sound wave here. I also get a preview on the drop layer of what the art looks like. Another way to adjust the size of your layers is to double-click the layer icon to open up the Layer Properties window. In there, you can adjust the layer height. So I can say 300%, click OK, and my layer height's bigger and giving me an even more expanded view of my layer. So to sync sound with an animation, drop it into a keyframe in the right place, and you can adjust the layer size through the timeline and through the Layer Properties window. In this movie, we'll look at adding sound to buttons. I've actually added sound to 4 out of 5 of the buttons on the stage, so we can test the application and see what it sounds like. So I'll roll over the trees on the left and all over the other buildings, and you'll hear the sound effects to the buttons. So as I roll over the buttons, the overstate plays a sound effect. Let's add the sound effect to the final button. I'm going to double-click the buildings on the left to enter the timeline. I'll create a new layer, call it Sound. I'll add a blank keyframe to the overframe by pressing F7 on the keyboard, and then all I'm going to do is click and drag the flash beep sound from the library onto the stage. That's all there is to it. So I'll test the movie again, roll over the buildings, and there's the sound effect. For button sound effects, I recommend using little to no compression on the sound. This sound sounded a little strange when I tested it with MP3 compression. So for that reason, I switched the compression to raw. And that way the sound effect is really clear.